Imagine a world where Steve McQueen, not Clint Eastwood, pulled the trigger as Dirty Harry. Or a world where McQueen, not Marlon Brando, whispered madness in the jungle of Apocalypse Now. These weren't wild fantasies. These were real offers, roles that could have changed McQueen's career forever. And yet, he walked away. Why would the king of cool reject scripts that became some of Hollywood's most legendary films? The truth isn't just about money, it's about ego, control, and the darker side of McQueen's own legend. This is the untold story of the roles Steve McQueen refused, and how those choices may have protected his image, but cost him something greater. From the very beginning, Steve McQueen's career was different. Most actors in the 1960s were still tied to studios, forced to accept whatever roles were handed down to them. But McQueen was never built for obedience. He came from the streets, the Marines, the world of survival. By the time he hit Hollywood, he had already lived 100 lives tougher than any script could imagine, and he wasn't about to let a studio tell him what to do. When he became a star in the early 60s with films like The Great Escape, McQueen's persona was already carved in stone. He was the rebel, the outsider, the man who played by his own rules. And off-screen, he carried the same philosophy. He was one of the first actors to use his contracts not just to get paid, but to gain leverage. He didn't chase fame for the sake of it. He chased freedom. If a role didn't fit his vision of himself, he simply refused it, no matter how big the paycheck. For McQueen, image was everything. He built his reputation carefully. The cool silence, the sunglasses, the fast cars, the physical grit. Audiences didn't just watch Steve McQueen. They believed him. That authenticity became his currency, and he guarded it fiercely. Accepting the wrong role could break the illusion, and McQueen wasn't willing to risk it. This stubborn independence gave him the power to turn down scripts that other actors would have killed for. Some called it arrogance. Others saw it as genius. Either way, McQueen knew that every no shaped his legend just as much as every yes. And it didn't take long before Hollywood realized the depth of his defiance. Because one of the very first massive roles that landed on his desk, a role that could have redefined an entire genre, was the story of a San Francisco cop with a .44 Magnum in his hand. The role that became Dirty Harry. And Steve McQueen said no. In 1971, Hollywood was looking for a new kind of hero. Audiences were no longer satisfied with clean-cut cops who played by the rules. America was restless, crime rates were rising, and people wanted grit on screen. Warner Brothers had the perfect script, Dirty Harry. It was raw, it was violent, and it centered on a cop who didn't wait for permission, Inspector Harry Callahan. The role was destined to shock audiences and spark debate. And when the script made its way across Hollywood, one name was at the top of the studio's wish list: Steve McQueen. On paper, it was perfect. McQueen had already electrified audiences in Bullitt just a few years earlier. He had the cool stare, the charisma, and the authority to make Harry Callahan unforgettable. But McQueen saw something else. He knew audiences already associated him with Bullitt, the tough San Francisco cop who delivered justice his own way. And he feared Dirty Harry would trap him in that image forever. So he said no. McQueen wasn't about to be typecast as a cop for the rest of his career. He wanted variety. He wanted roles that gave him freedom to stretch his persona. To him, Dirty Harry looked like a repeat performance, a film that would box him in when he was trying to break out. Instead, the part went to Clint Eastwood, and the rest is history. Eastwood's icy glare, his iconic .44 Magnum, and that unforgettable line, "Do you feel lucky, punk?" turned Dirty Harry into a cultural phenomenon. It spawned 4 sequels and cemented Eastwood as the face of vigilante justice in cinema. But imagine if McQueen had taken the role. His version of Harry Callahan would have been colder, quieter, maybe even more dangerous. Would the film have been bigger? Or would it have faded into the shadow of Bullitt? It's one of Hollywood's great what-ifs. But for McQueen, the decision was final. He walked away from a role that became a franchise, choosing to protect his image instead. And it wouldn't be the last time he turned down a part that went on to become legendary. Because just a few years later, another script landed on his desk. one that would take audiences deep into the jungles of Vietnam. Apocalypse Now. By the mid-1970s, Steve McQueen's star power was undeniable. He had conquered the box office, defied the studios, and cemented himself as the king of cool. But Hollywood was changing again. Audiences wanted darker, deeper, and more unsettling stories, and no film captured that shift better than Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. The role of Colonel Kurtz, the mysterious, half-mad officer hiding deep in the jungles of Vietnam, was one of the most haunting characters ever written. Coppola wanted someone who could bring both menace and charisma, someone whose very presence commanded attention. His first choice wasn't Marlon Brando. It was Steve McQueen. Coppola reportedly offered McQueen a staggering salary, over $1 million, to take the role. It would have been McQueen's darkest performance, a chance to prove himself as more than just the silent, tough guy. But McQueen hesitated. The filming conditions were brutal. Months of grueling shoots in the Philippines, unpredictable weather, health risks, and a director known for pushing his cast to the breaking point. McQueen, who valued control above all else, saw only chaos. And with his health already beginning to decline, he simply wasn't willing to put his body through the ordeal. So once again, McQueen said no. The role went to Marlon Brando, whose unpredictable behavior became legend. He arrived overweight, unprepared, and yet somehow delivered a performance that burned itself into cinema history. Apocalypse Now became one of the most acclaimed films ever made, and Colonel Kurtz became one of Brando's defining roles. But imagine McQueen in that jungle, his cold blue eyes glinting through the shadows, his quiet menace shaping the story. It could have been the performance of his career, or it could have broken him. For McQueen, the risk wasn't worth it. He walked away, leaving another iconic role behind. And yet, not all of his refusals were about danger or grueling shoots. Sometimes the roles he turned down were about something more personal: rivalry, ego, and the fear of being overshadowed. And nowhere was that more obvious than with a film that paired him with Paul Newman, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. In 1969, Hollywood had another game-changing script making the rounds: Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. A buddy western with charm, humor, and tragedy, it was designed to showcase two of the biggest stars of the era. And at first, the plan was simple: Paul Newman as Butch Cassidy, and Steve McQueen as the Sundance Kid. It was a dream pairing. Newman and McQueen were already two of the most bankable actors alive, both adored by audiences, both symbols of cool in very different ways. Together, they could have been unstoppable. But from the moment negotiations began, the project hit a wall, one that revealed just how fiercely McQueen guarded his image. The sticking point wasn't money, it wasn't the script, it was billing. McQueen demanded equal billing with Newman, not just shared, but top placement. He wanted his name on the left side of the poster, the spot audiences would read first. Newman, already a respected Hollywood veteran, wasn't about to budge. The standoff dragged on, and neither star would give an inch. For McQueen, this wasn't a minor detail. He believed every choice, every photo, every poster, every word, built his legend. Being second billed to Newman would make him look like a supporting player, and McQueen refused to be anyone's sidekick. In the end, the deal collapsed. McQueen walked away, and the role of Sundance Kid went to Robert Redford. The film became a cultural milestone, catapulting Redford to superstardom and solidifying his partnership with Newman as one of the most iconic duos in film history. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder, what if McQueen had swallowed his pride? Would Newman and McQueen have redefined the buddy movie forever? Or would their rivalry have burned the project to the ground from the inside? What's certain is this: McQueen's refusal wasn't just about a movie. It was about his identity, his refusal to ever appear smaller than his peers. But sometimes, his refusals weren't about ego or rivalry at all. Sometimes they were about fear, roles he believed could endanger his life, or scripts that clashed too deeply with his personal code. And that brings us to the darker side of his decisions, the roles he turned down because of danger, risk, and even death. For all of Steve McQueen's toughness, there were roles that even he wouldn't touch, not because of money, not because of rivalry, but because he believed some scripts could either kill him or damage the carefully built image of the King of Cool. McQueen was a thrill seeker, a man who raced motorcycles, tore through deserts in dune buggies, and pushed his cars to the limit on weekends. But when it came to films, he was selective about how far he would risk himself. He turned down several scripts with stunt sequences he thought were outright reckless. Unlike the carefully choreographed chase in Bullet, these films demanded stunts that McQueen believed were unsafe or unrealistic. He wasn't about to gamble his life for a cheap thrill, especially when he had a family and a racing career off-screen. But risk wasn't only physical. McQueen also worried about how certain roles would shape his public persona. He refused characters that portrayed weakness, cowardice, or anything that clashed with the silent strength audiences had come to expect from him. To McQueen, every performance added another brick to his legacy, and one wrong role could bring the whole thing crashing down. One infamous example was a script where the leading man spends much of the story running in fear, a part McQueen dismissed outright. "That's not me," he reportedly told friends. Another project required extensive underwater sequences, something McQueen had no interest in risking, given his history with asthma and health concerns. He knew his limits, and he stuck to them. Some critics called this arrogance, saying he passed up opportunities that could have stretched his talent. But McQueen didn't see it that way. To him, it was strategy. Protect the brand, protect the mystique. Never give audiences a version of Steve McQueen they couldn't believe in. And so he turned down roles that others might have jumped at. Dangerous stunts, unflattering characters, or scripts that just didn't feel true. But all of these refusals led to a bigger question, one that critics, fans, and historians still ask today. Did Steve McQueen's stubbornness protect his legend? Or did it limit how great he could have been? That question brings us to the final chapter of this story, the legacy of the roles he never played. When people look back at Steve McQueen's career, it's tempting to focus only on the films he made. The motorcycle jump in The Great Escape, the car chase in Bullet, the quiet fire he brought to The Magnificent Seven. But part of his legend lives in the films he didn't make: Dirty Harry, Apocalypse Now, Butch Cassidy, and The Sundance Kid. These roles could have reshaped his career, maybe even earned him the kind of awards and critical respect that often eluded him. But McQueen never measured success in statues or critics' praise. He measured it in freedom. Freedom to choose, freedom to walk away, freedom to live and die by his own rules. By saying no, McQueen preserved something most stars lost: control over his image. He avoided being typecast as just another cop. He sidestepped grueling productions that could have broken his health. And he refused to play second fiddle to anyone, even Paul Newman. In doing so, he protected the myth of Steve McQueen, the rebel, the outsider, the man who could never be tamed by Hollywood. Of course, these refusals came with a price. Some of the greatest films in history went on without him. Other actors made their names where McQueen might have stood. And it's impossible not to wonder, what if? What if McQueen had stared down Brando in the jungles of Vietnam? What if he and Newman had finally shared the screen? What if he had spoken the words, "Do you feel lucky, punk?" We'll never know. And maybe that's the point. The mystery of what Steve McQueen didn't do is just as powerful as the roles he did. It keeps his legend alive, his image untouchable, and his name forever linked to the golden age of Hollywood. In the end, Steve McQueen's greatest role wasn't written in any script. It was the role he wrote for himself, the King of Cool, the man who always stayed one step ahead, and the star who knew that sometimes the smartest move is the one you never make.